When the kidnappers forced Nelson to choose between two people, he abandoned his childhood sweetheart and picked me. But I didn't leave with him. Because I knew he would regret it. In my previous life, after I was rescued, Nelson's childhood sweetheart was humiliated by the kidnappers who took inappropriate photos of her. That same night, she took her own life. Nelson pretended not to care and went ahead with our wedding as planned, but after we got married, he made me suffer. 7 years later, I finally forced him to agree to a divorce. On the way to finalize it, he lost control of his emotions and drove us off a cliff. Even in his final moments, he blamed me. This was our debt to Lisa. We should have spent our lives atoning for her. What right do you have to live free from guilt? So now that I have another chance, I refuse to live that way again. Winnie, come with me. When I realized I had been reborn, the kidnappers were pressing a knife against both my and Lisa's necks. They demanded Nelson choose one of us to save. His eyes flickered between us, and after a long and painful internal struggle, he made the same choice as in the previous life. He reached out his hand toward me. But I firmly shook my head. Nelson, save Lisa first. In this life, I don't want to owe anyone, and I especially don't want to live burdened by another person's life. Nelson seemed relieved when he heard that. Winnie, you're my fiancée. I should save you first. But since you've said this, don't blame me. Then he hurriedly took Lisa and left, afraid I might change my mind. But unlike him, I don't regret my decisions. In the previous life, he came with the ransom, but the kidnappers suddenly demanded more and said only one person could leave first. Nelson had no choice and picked me. However, while we were gathering more money, the kidnappers became interested in Lisa and took inappropriate photos of her, preparing to assault her. Luckily, we arrived just in time with the police. Even though the worst hadn't happened, for a young girl, the humiliation was already unbearable. Lisa returned home broken, and that night, after everyone had gone to bed, she took her own life. By the time we found her, it was too late. Nelson didn't show any emotion when he heard the news. He calmly handled Lisa's funeral and gave her family a large sum of money. Even when I suggested postponing the wedding, he flatly refused. Winnie, marrying you was always part of the plan. We can't let someone else's situation affect it, right? But that someone else haunted him for the next 7 years. He only married me to trap me into making amends for Lisa. But what had I done wrong? After Nelson left with Lisa, I began thinking of ways to save myself. This time, I wasn't sure if Nelson would come back for me. In my previous life, when he hugged Lisa, he slipped a tracker into her pocket. So even when the kidnappers moved locations, we were able to find Lisa quickly. But this time, it seemed like he'd forgotten to do that. I suspected that from the beginning, the only person he truly wanted to save was Lisa. He only chose me because I was his fiancée, and he was afraid of the public's judgment. After all, our marriage was a business arrangement, and we didn't have much real affection between us. Meanwhile, Lisa had been with him through the most innocent years of his life. They were childhood sweethearts, best friends. It was no surprise that Nelson regretted his choice in the previous life. In this life, he could finally do what he truly wanted. I was happy for him. But I didn't forget to seize the chance to escape. I knew that when the kidnappers moved locations, they would pass by an auto repair shop. The workers there were fierce brawlers. In my previous life, when the kidnappers tried to take over the repair shop, they hadn't expected the owner to be so tough. A fight broke out, and the kidnappers, shocked to meet opponents even more vicious than themselves, were forced to retreat. Later, when the kidnappers were arrested, the repair shop owner even testified against them. Now, just like before, they left one person to guard me in the car while the others went to the repair shop. My hands were tied behind my back, and the kidnapper driving the car didn't pay me any mind. Taking advantage of his distraction, I bit through the door handle inside the car. Then, I kicked open the door and bolted forward with all my strength. Like the kidnappers, my destination was the auto repair shop. I was betting that the workers wouldn't turn a blind eye. So I ran straight inside, not bothering to hide. The shop was already in chaos. I immediately spotted the young shop owner. His features were sharp and handsome, radiating a natural sense of righteousness. Combined with his agile movements, there was something undeniably cool about him. Not wanting to get caught in the crossfire, I crouched and quickly dashed toward him. I miscalculated and ended up crashing into him, knocking him to the ground. As I fell into his arms, I was so scared, my face went pale. "I'm sorry," I stammered, apologizing incoherently. "Could you, please help me?" The man glanced at me, his brow furrowed. In the next second, he pulled me down and rolled with me across the ground several times. Then, with a loud bang, a chair crashed down where we had just been lying. If he hadn't reacted so quickly, I would have been in serious trouble. Still trembling, I realized the kidnappers had noticed my escape. What had started as a turf dispute now turned into a hostage situation. The two sides were at a standoff. I looked up at the man beside me and whispered, "If you save me, I'll do anything you ask." But he didn't reply. Instead, he stared thoughtfully at the group of kidnappers. A voice behind him finally broke the silence. "Davis, it's not worth getting involved." So his name was Davis. Still getting no answer, my heart sank. Fine, I wouldn't force him. When the leader of the kidnappers shouted for the third time, telling me to come over, I took a step forward. But before I could move any further, a hand pressed down on my shoulder, stopping me. Davis stepped forward and said to the kidnappers, "This woman belongs to me now." It seemed like even fate was on my side, as the roar of motorcycles suddenly echoed from outside. A confident smile spread across Davis's face. "My backup's here." The kidnappers, clearly frustrated, glared at me before cursing under their breath and leaving. Finally, the tension in my chest released. I let out a quiet sigh of relief as I felt the ropes around my wrists loosen. It was Davis, cutting them off. "My name's Winnie. Thank you so much for earlier," I said, extending my hand toward him. But Davis just stared at the raw marks on my wrists, where the ropes had cut into my skin, leaving angry red welts. "Let me take care of that for you." I shook my head. "It's just a scratch." "It's nothing. Wasn't it you who said you'd do anything if I saved you?" Without waiting for my response, he pushed me into a chair and grabbed a first aid kit. "Hold still." I bit my lip as I watched him carefully tend to my wounds. A warmth suddenly bloomed in my chest. In my previous life, after Nelson and I had just gotten married, there was a time when he got drunk. While helping him to his room, I merely suggested that he drink less. He flew into a rage, shoving me hard. I lost my balance and fell. The bracelet on my wrist shattered as it hit the floor, and the shards cut into my skin. I screamed in pain, holding my bleeding wrist. Nelson just looked at me coldly and said, "Hurts, doesn't it? Good." Lisa's pain was 1,000 times worse, but she can't cry out anymore. If it wasn't for saving you, she would never have been humiliated by the kidnappers. She wouldn't have taken her life. I sat on the floor in shock, unable to believe what I was hearing. My heart turned cold, bit by bit. After a long time, I found my voice again. "But the kidnappers took both Lisa and me to threaten you. And it was you who chose to save me first. How can you say these things to me now?" Nelson, looking much more sober, stared at me with the same icy gaze. "Winnie, I never agreed with this marriage. If you hadn't told my grandmother you liked me, she wouldn't have forced me to marry you. So, what you're saying is that if it weren't for me, you would have only needed to save Lisa, right?" I laughed bitterly. "Nelson, you are sick. Instead of blaming the kidnappers, you blame me." I got up and went back to my room to tend to my wound on my own. Since then, no matter how much it hurt, I never told Nelson about it. Now, the person in front of me, afraid I was in pain, was awkwardly blowing on my wound. My eyes stung, so I closed them and took a deep breath, then asked knowingly, "What are you doing?" Davis looked up, his smile pure. "When I was a kid and got hurt, my mom would do this. Does it feel better?" I nodded. "Yeah, much better." Encouraged, Davis continued with what he was doing. But the atmosphere was quickly disrupted. "Davis, I heard someone was causing trouble at your repair shop, so I came right over." "Holy crap. Where'd you find such a pretty girl?" A tall man with a tattooed arm walked in, his eyes lighting up the moment he saw me. Wow, this is rare. I think it's the first time I've seen such a beautiful girl here at your place. As he spoke, a strange hint of shyness crept across his face. Seeing this, Davis quickly stepped in front of me, shielding me. Thanks, but the problem's already been taken care of. The rest has nothing to do with you. I'll buy you a drink another day. The tattooed man paused, then realized what Davis was implying. Davis, now that you've got a girl, you don't even want to hang out with your buddies? He sounded a bit angry. Davis sighed, then pulled him aside and whispered, "Can't you take a hint? Go find somewhere else to be." "Is she your girlfriend?" the man asked. "What do you think?" Davis replied. "She looks like she could be. You two really look good together. Glad you've got good taste. Well, you better invite me to the wedding. Don't worry, you'll be there." Though they were trying to whisper, I could still hear every word of their conversation from a short distance away. To ease the awkwardness, I pretended to be busy, looking around and avoiding eye contact. A few minutes later, Davis managed to send the tattooed man away. After he left, Davis asked me, "Where do you live? I'll take you home." Maybe it was a selfish impulse, but suddenly, I didn't feel like going home so soon. My parents were always busy with their own things, and even if I didn't go home for a month, they wouldn't notice. As for Nelson, if I wasn't mistaken, he probably got a second chance at life too. He's probably dying to stay with Lisa for the rest of his life right about now. In my last life, we were married for 7 years, and he never took me to any events or even shared a bed with me. When people asked about me, he'd always respond with a cold face, making me the laughingstock of our circle. In this life, I'm staying far away from him. So I looked at Davis and pleaded, "Can you let me stay here for a few days?" Judging from both lifetimes, Davis seemed like a good person. Plus, he could protect me. If I latched onto him, would he reject me? Davis suddenly leaned in closer, his gaze intense. "If you keep this up, I might just take you seriously." With the closeness between us, I could even smell the fresh scent of soap on him. I swallowed involuntarily, about to speak when a familiar voice came from behind me. "What are you two doing?" It was Nelson. And he had brought the police with him. "Are you okay?" Nelson looked at me, and the concern in his eyes didn't seem fake. I shrugged. "Do I look like I'm not okay?" Nelson was silent. Lisa came in next. She glanced at the repair shop, which had returned to normal operations, and asked bluntly, "Winnie, how did you escape from the kidnappers?" "From what I know, there were 6 of them, and your hands were tied. You were in an unfamiliar place." "I'm really curious. What did she mean by that?" "Everyone knows your 2 families are planning to marry, and both are after that land in the south of the city. The auction is in 10 days, and whoever bids higher, gets it. But just at this critical moment, something like this happens, and the ransom was sky high. Winnie, I really find it hard not to be suspicious." Was she implying I hired the kidnappers myself? I admit, in both lives, I've never felt so speechless. In the last life, I felt sorry for what Lisa went through. But in this life, I saved her. Yet, the first thing she did after being saved was turn around and bite me. It was disheartening. I raised my hand suddenly and shouted, "Officer, someone is slandering me here." And with that, we were all taken to the station. While waiting for questioning, Lisa still wouldn't let up. "Winnie, why won't you speak up?" I snorted. "Why should I talk to you? You're not the police." Lisa was momentarily speechless. Nelson, unable to watch any longer, immediately spoke up for her. "Winnie, Lisa just wants to understand what happened so she knows what to say during questioning and what not to say." "Oh, so you're planning to lie in front of the police?" Nelson, frustrated, stood up and pointed at me. "Winnie, you're being unreasonable." Just then, Davis came out of the interrogation room and, without a word, stepped in front of me. "Put your hand down." His tone was calm, yet carried an unmistakable authority. Hiding behind Davis, I couldn't see their faces, but I could feel the tension in the air. I heard Nelson ask, "Who are you to her?" Davis turned slightly to look at me, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "What do you think?" he replied. I looked up at his perfect profile, which was so close, and, on impulse, I winked at him. Nelson saw this, and his face turned several shades darker. Just then, the police called him in for questioning. After the interrogation, things began to clear up. The police had identified the suspects, and now they just needed to catch the kidnappers to move forward with the investigation. But I knew this whole thing was orchestrated by Nelson's competitor. As we left the station, Davis turned to me and said, "It's fine." Huh? I was confused. He explained, "What you asked me about earlier, it's fine." I finally understood, he was talking about letting me stay with him. "It's just me and my mom at home, but she's gone back to the family estate, and I usually stay at the repair shop." "You're welcome to stay." I was about to agree when Nelson interrupted. "Winnie, your parents already know about the kidnapping. They're probably on their way home from the airport now. Are you sure you don't want to go back?" I couldn't help but feel a pang in my heart. Nelson, an outsider, knew more about my parents than I did. For as long as I could remember, they'd always been too busy to remember my birthday, too busy to attend my graduation. I even purposely did poorly in school or injured myself just to see them. Because only then would they show up, offering me a small bit of fleeting attention. Eventually, I stopped hoping, and learned to celebrate my own birthday, even paying a flower seller to attend my graduation for me, because she was kind and beautiful. That's how I grew up, alone, until I met Nelson. We were at the school basketball court when he casually blocked a ball that was about to hit me. In the sunlight, his face was strikingly handsome, with beads of sweat rolling down his forehead, sparkling like crystals. His eyes held a slight arrogance as he said, "Hey, be careful." With that cool voice, I was smitten at first sight. Back then, I was shy, and only muttered a quick thanks before running off. After that, I started to pay attention to him, on purpose or by chance, and I learned that he had a close childhood friend. But their relationship seemed to stop there. My teenage crush was silent yet spread through my heart. Even a random encounter or accidental glance made my heart race and my face flush. I knew that I probably wouldn't have much say in my future marriage. So when I found out that the family I was to marry into was Nelson's, I was happy for a long time. My parents were also fond of Nelson and kept in touch with him more than they did with me. In my last life, when I asked for a divorce, my parents immediately rejected it. "Nelson's capable and puts up with your bad habits. Why can't you just cherish him instead of making us worry?" I know that ever since we got married, our two families' companies have been tied together. Getting a divorce isn't something that can be done easily. Because of this, I endured for years, but in the end, I fell into depression and started self-harming. Only then did Nelson agree to the divorce. Now that I've been given a second chance, I want to live for myself this time. That's why I don't want to go home. However, I suddenly remembered something I still need to take care of, so I have to go back. Before leaving, I pulled out Davis's phone from his pocket, entered my number, and called myself. When I heard the ringtone, I handed the phone back to him. "Make sure you save my number. I'll come find you in a couple of days." With that, I flagged down a taxi and left. The whole time, I didn't even spare Nelson a glance. When I got home, I found my parents sitting in the living room, waiting for me. Before I could say anything, they immediately started scolding me. "Nelson told us everything that happened today. Can you stop being so reckless in the future? Those were kidnappers. You could have gotten yourself killed. And you actually let Nelson save someone else first?" At this point, my mom let out a heavy sigh. "How can we trust you with the company when you act like this?" They didn't trust me, so in my last life, they handed the company over to Nelson. And then they relaxed, chasing after the dreams they had in their youth. My father, who had been silently sitting on the couch, suddenly spoke, "Let's arrange the wedding soon." "I don't agree," I replied, my tone leaving no room for discussion. "I came back to tell you that tomorrow, I'm calling off the engagement. Whether you agree or not, this time, I'm making the decision. And don't bother trying to threaten me with the company. You can give it to whoever you want. I don't want it anyway." Now that I've been reborn, I already know the trends of the next 7 years. I'm not going to end up broke. With those words, I headed to my room. They're probably even more disappointed in me now, huh? Doesn't matter. The next day, I got up early. But when I went downstairs, I saw my mom had made breakfast and was waiting for me. The housekeeper told me you were up late last night looking for food. It's my fault, I forgot to ask if you ate dinner, she said softly. I froze, unable to figure out why my mom suddenly became so gentle. She lovingly tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, speaking with a guilty tone. Your father and I reflected on things last night. Maybe we'd been doing it all wrong. We wanted you to grow up independent, so we didn't spoil you too much, afraid we'd raise you to be arrogant. If you want to make your own decisions, fine. We're not going to force you to marry him. Are they really agreeing to let me call off the engagement? Suddenly, I felt a pang of sadness. The young Winnie had cried and thrown tantrums before, but all she got in return was scolding. Later, she learned to behave, thinking that would make them take her seriously. But in the end, they only saw her as weak and useless. Now, I've just said a few harsh words using their own methods, and they've changed their minds? I still couldn't believe it, even as the car arrived at the Shin family villa. The idea of the arranged marriage actually came from Nelson's grandmother. It started because I once saved her at a party when she fainted due to low blood sugar. After she regained consciousness, she was so grateful that she insisted on making me her adopted granddaughter. Over time, we became close. I'd even have dinner at their family estate occasionally. It wasn't until one day when I ran into Nelson there that I realized this woman was his grandmother. She was sharp, too. She immediately noticed I liked Nelson. That's how all of this started. Now, having to tell her that I'm breaking off the engagement makes me feel a little guilty. After all, she already gave me her family's heirloom bracelet. But now, I'll have to return it. Nelson arrived before me, and Lisa was with him. They were both dressed up, looking ready to celebrate their engagement as soon as I called mine off. Everyone wins, I guess. But when I put the bracelet on the table, Nelson grabbed my wrist and asked, "What's the meaning of this?" Right. I had only told him to meet me at the estate last night. I didn't mention calling off the engagement. Nelson's grandmother looked between us, as if she had a sense of what was happening. Winnie, did Nelson do something to upset you? She asked, shooting Lisa a sharp glance. I spoke to her respectfully. I'm here to call off the engagement with Nelson. My voice was calm, as if I were talking about the weather. Nelson's eyes widened, disbelief flashing across his face. Why? He asked. Because yesterday, you left me to save someone else. I assume she's the one you really want to marry, right? I glanced at Lisa, who was staring back at me, looking like a defiant little rabbit. No, Nelson's expression wavered as he muttered, but you're the one who told me to save Lisa first. That was a test, and your answer was clear. Nelson fell silent, unable to argue. Nelson's grandmother sighed and said, I've heard about what happened yesterday. You're a good girl, Winnie. Nelson just doesn't deserve you. Grandma. Nelson interrupted, gripping my wrist tightly as if he wanted to crush my bones. Winnie, I won't agree to this. Don't even think about it. The wound on my wrist from yesterday hadn't fully healed yet, and now it felt like it was bleeding again from his grip. I suppressed the pain and suddenly found the situation amusing. In my last life, after Lisa died, Nelson mourned her for 7 whole years. Now that I've come back, he's eager to save her again. I thought he must love her deeply and couldn't wait to marry her. I curled my lips into a smile and said, if that's the case, I'll just go to the media tomorrow and announce the breakup myself. Then it'll be your family's reputation that takes the hit. With that, I pried Nelson's fingers off one by one and turned to leave. I didn't expect Nelson to chase after me. Coincidentally, Davis had just arrived on his motorcycle at the villa gate. Not wanting to argue with Nelson anymore, I said, sorry, my boyfriend's here to pick me up. Nelson frowned in displeasure, mocking, Winnie, are you really going to date some broke guy like him? Do you think he can make you happy? Well, it's better than someone like you, hypocritical and two-faced. I started walking toward Davis, but the next second, Nelson grabbed my wrist again. Ah. I winced in pain. Only then did Nelson notice the injury on my wrist. He panicked and tried to explain, I didn't know you were hurt. I lowered my eyes, my smile full of irony. Like knowing would make you care. Seeing this, Davis couldn't hold back anymore. He threw a punch and knocked Nelson to the ground, quick and precise. Nelson spat out blood, a fierce glint in his eyes, but he didn't dare move again. Davis, in a warning tone, said, "Stay away from her." He then placed his helmet on my head, started the bike, and we sped off. As the motorcycle raced through the mountain roads, the scenery blurred past. Leaning against Davis's back, I let the rush of speed temporarily wash away the unpleasantness. "So, girlfriend, where do you want to go?" Davis's voice came from in front of me. I chuckled, so he heard everything earlier. I wrapped my arms around his waist and said, "Well, since you called me your girlfriend, can I come over? I'm starving." "Of course, no problem. I'm a pretty good cook, you know. I want 4 dishes." "You got it." Davis's laughter echoed through the mountains. Maybe it was his influence, but at this moment, my heart felt lighter than ever. Davis's house was bigger than I had imagined. He fumbled around and brought me a brand new pair of men's slippers. "They might be a bit big, but this is the only new pair I have." I slipped them on casually and smiled, "No worries. Luckily, I come back and tidy up sometimes, so it shouldn't be too messy." Even though he was the host, he seemed more nervous than I was. I plopped down on the sofa, resting my chin on my hand, and said, "I don't know how to cook, so I'll have to trouble you today." But instead of heading to the kitchen, Davis brought over a first aid kit. The wound that had been bandaged yesterday was squeezed by Nelson today, causing blood to seep through and stick to the gauze. Davis carefully poured iodine onto the gauze, trying to separate it from the wound. For such delicate work, he was surprisingly meticulous for a man. Half an hour later, the wound was rebandaged. He didn't forget to remind me, "Don't let it get wet for the next couple of days." I instinctively asked, "How am I supposed to shower then?" "Going 2 days without a shower is fine," he thought for a moment and added, "I won't mind." "You better not." "I wouldn't dare." "Humph. So, should I go make dinner now?" I nodded with a smile. Suddenly, I realized that every time I was with Davis, I felt completely at ease. An hour later, he brought out 4 dishes. He handed me some utensils. "Try them." I tasted a few bites and gave him a thumbs up. The flavors, the presentation, it was all perfect, just like him. Looks like I won't have to worry about where to eat in the future. In the afternoon, I got a call from my dad. He told me to attend an auction happening in 10 days. If I could secure the land in the southern part of the city, the company would be handed over to me entirely. I knew about that plot of land. Besides our 2 families, a few other companies had their eyes on it as well. In my past life, I was shaken up by the kidnapping, and after Lisa's death, I couldn't help but feel emotionally unsettled. I got seriously ill and missed that auction. But even if I hadn't fallen ill, I wouldn't have competed against Nelson. Back then, I was completely devoted to him, believing I had finally found someone I could spend my life with. At that time, Nelson's family was in a debt crisis, and it was tough for him to secure that land. In the end, I secretly transferred a sum of money from my company to help him. Nelson won the auction and built a theme park on the land, attracting many businesses and elevating his family to new heights within a few years. It's clear that the land was a gold mine, otherwise, so many people wouldn't be after it. But this time, I'm determined to get it. What I didn't expect was for Lisa to come begging me. Her attitude was completely different from the aggressive one she had a few days ago. This time, she lowered herself, speaking in a humble tone. "Can you not break off your engagement with Nelson? He and I have always been just friends. If you agree, I'll never appear in front of you again." I looked at her silently, feeling nothing but exasperation. Yes, in my past life, I thought the same, that they were just close friends. But after Lisa died, Nelson's actions made it clear that his feelings went beyond mere friendship. I remember the day he agreed to divorce me. It was after my 10th suicide attempt due to depression. When he came back, he found me lying on the floor, covered in blood. He must have been scared I'd die in his house, so he finally agreed to the divorce. But on the way to the courthouse, he suddenly asked, "Do you know what today is?" "It's Lisa's death anniversary." I stared at him blankly and shook my head. I couldn't even take care of myself. How was I supposed to remember something like that? But my response enraged him. He slammed his fist on the steering wheel and yelled, calling me cold and heartless. "Your life now was bought with Lisa's life, but you've never been grateful, not even remembering her death anniversary. You think leaving me will ease your guilt? Winnie, you disgust me." I was furious too, so I snapped back, "Yeah? You're so grateful, you can't forget her, so why didn't you just die with her?" As soon as the words left my mouth, the car swerved wildly and plunged off a cliff. Even as we were about to die, Nelson was still blaming me. "We owed Lisa, we should have spent this life atoning for her. What right do you have to seek peace for yourself? But in this life, we owe each other nothing. I can't wait to see what fate has in store for Nelson." I made a gesture, signaling to Lisa to stop talking. Thinking about the past really made me sick. "Do you not understand the situation? You've already acknowledged that the engagement is over. Did Nelson send you?" She shook her head. "No, I just don't want to see him lose." "Winnie, didn't you always love Nelson? This whole thing is my fault. I shouldn't have suspected you of hiring the kidnappers, and I shouldn't have suddenly returned from abroad. If I hadn't, Nelson wouldn't have hurt you while trying to save me." She was starting to confuse me. "Don't want to see him lose?" Lisa explained, "Nelson's family needs that land in the south to recover. If you're set on breaking off the engagement, can you at least not compete with him?" I scoffed, "Are you dreaming?" Now I finally understood. In my past life, when we rushed to rescue Lisa, the police had already captured the kidnappers, and the ransom money was recovered. With the money I gave him, Nelson secured the land. But now, because I saved myself, the kidnappers fled, and no one knows where they are. The police haven't found any solid leads, let alone recovered the ransom. So, Nelson's family has lost its edge in acquiring the land. Lisa still wouldn't give up. She gritted her teeth and suddenly knelt before me. "Winnie, I'm begging you. You don't have to love him, but can you at least not ruin him? I've seen emotional blackmail before, but never anything this shameless." I bent down, leaning close to her, and whispered. "When you heard Nelson was going to marry me, you went abroad, but when you heard we were engaged, you rushed back. You're right. This is all your fault. So, you should help him. Your family isn't as wealthy as mine, but they can help a little, right? Besides, last time, the money he used was to save you, not me. So, who's the foolish one here, you or me?" Lisa's face turned pale. Her lips moved, but no words came out. It'd be best if she figured things out on her own. If not, it's her loss. During this time, I went home and found that my parents had left again. It seems they're still the same, chasing their own desires without change. All they need is a suitable heir, they don't care who. Whatever, it's not like I care about them that much anyway. After 2 days of resting at home, my hand had mostly healed. I took a car from the garage and drove straight to Davis's repair shop. Before I even saw Davis, I ran into that tattooed guy from before. He called out awkwardly, "Hey. Where's Davis?" I asked him. He scratched his head and replied, "Davis went out." "Do you need him for something?" Just as he finished speaking, he slapped his own mouth and muttered, "Why can't someone just look for him without a reason? I talk too much." Then, he grinned at me and said, "You can relax here for a bit. Davis should be back soon." I nodded and sat down on the couch. On the coffee table, there were several different sets of teaware. I made myself some tea and slowly sipped it. The tattooed guy didn't leave, instead, he stayed there, his face full of curiosity as he kept sneaking glances at me. Seeing me make tea on my own, he explained, "I don't know how to do that. Usually, Davis makes it for me. Don't mind me." I looked up and asked, "What's your name?" "Liam." "Does Davis treat you well?" I wasn't sure why, but I just had a feeling. Liam shook his head, and I thought I'd guessed wrong. Then, he said, "No, it's not just me. Davis is good to all of us." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh? Tell me more." "The employees here at the repair shop, most of them come from poor mountain areas. Many of them have some kind of physical limitation. For example, Primo, who handles engine repairs, he can't speak, but just by hearing the sound, he can pinpoint where the problem is. Then there's Sam, who handles maintenance, he has a limp. Toby, who does the painting, can't read a single word. When they first came to the city, they were just trying to find a way to make a living. But once they arrived, they realized that having physical disabilities and no skills or qualifications made it nearly impossible to find a decent job. Davis took them in, gave them time to learn the skills, provided food, housing, and paid them. And so, this group of people has been loyal to him, not willing to go anywhere else." I understood now. I looked at Liam again and asked, "What about you?" At this, for the first time, his expression turned serious. "I met Davis 5 years ago. I'd crossed the wrong people and almost got beaten to death. It was Davis who saved me. From that moment on, I swore to follow Davis for life. If anyone dares to hurt him, they'll have to step over my dead body first." Honestly, hearing this shook me. All my life, I've lived in isolation, never having many people truly care for me. But Davis had managed to gather such a loyal group, all working hard for him. I was genuinely envious and found myself wanting to see him as soon as possible. "Do you know where he went?" Liam thought for a moment and said, "Davis didn't say exactly, but it seemed like someone was meeting him near Victor Square." Just as I was about to leave, Liam suddenly remembered something and added, "Oh, by the way, Davis is actually pretty wealthy. He's just very low-key about it. He didn't let us call you by your name at first, said you were from a rich family and we should call you Miss." I frowned at that. Why was Davis using such an outdated title? But little did I expect that when I reached the cafe at Victor Square, I'd see Davis sitting with Lisa. I didn't know what Lisa was saying to Davis, but her eyes were red, like she had been crying. Davis was just listening, his brow furrowed deeply. After watching for a while, I saw Lisa suddenly stand up and sit next to Davis. My instincts told me there was more to their relationship. Before today, I might have just left and blocked Davis without a second thought. Having been hurt once before, I couldn't tolerate any kind of impure relationship again. But this time, if it was Davis, I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt. Just as I was about to walk into the cafe, I saw Davis quickly stand up, as if he didn't want to deal with something troublesome. And then he locked eyes with me as I entered the shop. Compared to my calm demeanor, Davis was clearly surprised to see me there, hesitating for a second before striding toward me. "Winnie." At that moment, Lisa came rushing out too, looking somewhat desperate. "Davis, if you'll just agree, I..." Her words stopped abruptly when she saw me. But she quickly composed herself, turning to me and asking, "Winnie, what are you doing here?" "Are you also here to see Davis?" she asked, her body instinctively leaning toward him. However, Davis was quick to act. As soon as she leaned in, he darted over to my side. With an innocent look in his eyes, he said, "Winnie, I..." I pretended to be stern, "I'll deal with you when we get home." Seeing how we interacted, Lisa's face darkened. "Winnie, I really underestimated you." I shrugged. "Yeah, I think so too." Lisa was clearly frustrated, her face turning from red to white to green, like a messy palette of colors. To be honest, I wasn't the type to suffer losses. In my previous life, if I hadn't wasted time on people who didn't care about me, I wouldn't have ended up the way I did. Davis brought me home. By this time, the sky had already gone dark. We curled up on the couch, not saying a word. After a long silence, he was the first to break it. "Aren't you going to ask? Didn't you say you'd deal with me later?" I sighed softly. "If you want to tell me, you'll say it whether I ask or not. If you don't, then asking won't make any difference." Davis's face remained expressionless. "Do you know why Lisa came to see me?" I shook my head. On the way back, I had thought of a lot of possible reasons. Maybe Lisa had feelings for Davis? Or maybe Nelson, who didn't like seeing us together, had sent her to stir things up between us. After all, they were close and would do anything for each other. But then Davis suddenly asked me if I had my eye on that piece of land in the southern part of the city. I was shocked. How did you know? Because that land belongs to me now. My father left it to me. What a coincidence. Wait. So Lisa hadn't given up and came straight to Davis, trying to get the land through him? But how did she even know it was Davis's land? There was only one answer: Nelson must have told her. In his previous life, Nelson must have dealt with Davis while acquiring the land, so he knew. Seeing Davis staring at me, I suddenly realized something. You don't think I'm with you because of the land, do you? For some reason, a wave of discomfort surged in my chest. So, while I was worrying about him, he was also doubting me. I lowered my head, wanting to laugh, but I couldn't. Sensing something, Davis suddenly cupped my face in his hands and said seriously, "Of course, I don't think that." The thought did cross my mind once, but I quickly dismissed it. I trust my instincts. I asked, like when you decided to save Liam and the others? Davis raised an eyebrow. No, you're different from them. I saved them out of kindness. I saved you because I was drawn to you. Davis, you're really something. I pouted, slightly annoyed. He's so smooth. How many girlfriends has he had? Davis looked at me lovingly, his hand still on my face, gently lifting my chin. Then he kissed me, a quick, light touch, like a dragonfly skimming the surface. It's not about being smooth. It's genuine, instinctual, following my heart. My cheeks burned, and my heart pounded uncontrollably. Afraid he'd notice, I buried my face in his chest. My ear was pressed against his chest, where his heartbeat was loud like thunder, pounding steadily, as if it were declaring his love for me. I closed my eyes and said softly after a while, "Davis, I like you just as much as you like me." He didn't answer with words. Instead, he pulled me closer, so tight that it felt like he wanted to make me a part of him. The next morning, when I got up, Davis handed me a document. I took it and realized it was a land use rights transfer agreement, with my name on it. Davis, are you crazy? Do you know what this means? I could hardly believe it. Who would be this foolish? I've withdrawn from the auction. You want it, and I happen to have it, so why not give it to you? Saying I wasn't moved would be a lie. My heart felt like it was filled with something warm and swelling. I blinked, forcing the tears back. This is a good thing, I shouldn't cry. Since he's showing such sincerity, I can't let myself be outdone. I grabbed him and, as we walked, said, "Before you sign, there's somewhere I need to take you." I brought him to the marriage registration office. Davis repeatedly asked me, "Are you sure about this?" I smiled at him and replied, "Aren't you worried that I'll take everything you've given me, dump you, and then find someone richer and more handsome?" Davis frowned and thought for a moment. Richer, maybe. But more handsome? That might be hard. Exactly. That's why I brought you here, didn't I? I didn't expect Nelson to show up so quickly. Davis and I had just walked out of the marriage registration office, and we hadn't even put away our marriage certificates yet. Nelson saw the scene and his face turned ashen, his clenched fists trembling uncontrollably. He spoke, "Winnie, you really ended up with him. You're out of your mind." I rolled my eyes, not intending to respond to him. But Nelson grabbed me, and suddenly, 2 lines of tears rolled down his face. Were those crocodile tears? But there were still some things I wanted to say to him, so I asked Davis to wait for me in the car. Once it was just the two of us, Nelson couldn't wait to speak. "Winnie, I regret it. I truly regret it. You can hit me, curse me, whatever you want, just please forgive me." I scoffed and asked coldly, "Regret? Regret what? Not saving me, or not treating me well in the past life?" Hearing this, Nelson loosened his grip on my wrist, and the color drained from his face in an instant. It seemed he didn't even want to recall the events of the past life. After all, those memories clearly exposed all his wrongdoings. At this point, Nelson started slapping himself, saying, "I was blinded by my own stupidity. It's my fault. I deserve this. But Winnie, is there any chance for us?" I paused, then asked him lightly. Nelson, what do you think? He stopped moving, lowered his eyes, and looked utterly defeated. Then suddenly, a glimmer of hope appeared in his eyes. No, it was Lisa. She's the one who ruined us. If she hadn't come back, none of this would have happened. And I never asked her to come to you, it was all her doing, her wishful thinking. He grabbed my hand again, pleading desperately, please trust me one last time, okay? You've always been the one I love, truly. I know I've done wrong, so I won't ask for anything. I just want you to look at me again, even if I have to be the third party. I stared at Nelson in shock, unable to believe those words came from his mouth. I yanked my hand back and wiped it on my clothes. Nelson, what are you even after? Of course, I didn't believe he truly loved me. Once you've experienced real love, you can only see this as worthless garbage. Nelson put on a deeply emotional expression. I realized it too late, but no matter what, I won't give up on you. I felt a chill down my spine, like being haunted by a ghost. Nelson, if you keep this up, I'm calling the police. Nelson froze, his tears flowing freely as if they were endless. I was simply annoyed, wishing I could leave right away. Nelson, the only person you've ever loved is yourself. Neither Lisa nor I have ever been as important to you as your own interests. But you can't stand it, can you? How I've thrived after leaving you, and so you want to drag me back down into the abyss. But, Nelson, I'm no longer alone. My husband now is fierce and tough in a fight, and he has a group of people loyal to him. If you have a death wish, you're welcome to try. After I said that, I glanced at Lisa, who was standing not too far away. I had noticed her following us from the start, but I hadn't said anything. I just hoped she would see Nelson's true colors and stop being used. And just like that, the farce came to an end. After my father learned I had successfully acquired the land, he kept his promise and handed over the company for me to manage. I didn't tell anyone about Davis and I registering our marriage because I didn't want anyone to disturb us. I just wanted to live a peaceful life together. Time passed quietly between the company and home. Not long after, I heard that Lisa was going abroad. The person who loved Nelson the most in this world didn't want him anymore either. Before she left, she wrote a long post on social media, condemning Nelson for his betrayal and cold-heartedness. With nothing better to do, I boosted the post's visibility a little. As a result, Nelson's already debt-ridden family saw their stock prices plummet further, and they were soon on the verge of bankruptcy. Nelson was running around frantically, looking for help. But at this point, who would be willing to help him? So, he came to me again. It had been several months since we last saw each other. I was now busy developing the land, excited by the thought of making a fortune. But the Nelson in front of me was a shadow of the man I saw months ago. His face was gaunt, with dark circles under his eyes, stubble on his chin, and an air of utter despair. I asked him, "Are you here to ask for my help?" Surprisingly, he shook his head. He told me, "Winnie, I've been diagnosed with depression. I haven't had a good night's sleep in months. I finally understand the pain you went through. This is my karma." I suppressed the smile tugging at the corners of my lips and said, "Karma? No, this is a blessing for you. Think about it, in your last life, you died regretting that you didn't save Lisa. Even with success and me by your side, you were still unhappy. But now, fate has given you another chance. You've lost everything, sure, but you've made up for your past regrets. Isn't that enough? Fate hasn't treated you too badly. People, after all, can't be too greedy. When you gain something, you lose something else, you can't have it all." That was the last time I saw Nelson. 3 months later, on the night Nelson's family declared bankruptcy, Nelson drank too much, had a depressive episode, and fell into his bathtub. By the time he was found, he was already gone. Davis found out about this while he was giving me a back rub. My dad always told me that if someone's character is bad, they're doomed to fail. I turned over and couldn't help but ask, "How far do you think we can go?" Davis thought for a moment and said, "Given who we are, living together for 100 years doesn't seem unreasonable, does it?" I wholeheartedly agreed. Definitely not unreasonable. Then wanting a good meal from my wife isn't unreasonable either, right? Davis looked at me intensely, his eyes reflecting me like the most beautiful rose in the world. They say love is like tending to a flower. Davis cherishes me deeply, never letting me suffer or endure hardship, and as a result, I've grown more and more brilliant. Everything I couldn't attain in my past life, Davis has given me in abundance. I wrapped my arms around his neck, kissed him on the lips, and said, not unreasonable at all. The end.